From tracking a pandemic to how we manage big data or searching to find the nearest takeaway, digital map applications have completely transformed the technology of mapping. The results are staggering. We can now zoom in and out of the virtual globe and down to our own street view in seconds, drawing on previously unimaginable levels of geographical data. But these applications are also affecting our cognition, the way we are being wired to think. The paper map with its scales, grid references and contour lines is on the wane. But what is being gained and what is being lost? What are these mapping applications doing to us? And can our actions and beliefs be shaped by them, even without us realising it? I'm Jerry Broughton. I write about maps, and in this programme I investigate the consequences of the shift from paper to pixels, to the point that we too are now on the map as never before.
The coronavirus continues to spread at speed. This time last week we were talking about
the risk level has risen.
We are in uncharted territory.
At a time of global pandemic and international demonstrations, digital maps have a vital role to play in public health, but also in questionable methods of surveillance of users. Maps have always served the interests of power and authority. The question now is, whose interest does digital mapping serve?
With Google Earth 4.3, you can view photorealistic 3D buildings faster.
This is a story about the creation of the online world.
Welcome to Google Maps.
In particular, the seemingly irresistible rise of Google's map apps. In terms of what you see happening with Google, are we experiencing a sort of quiet revolution in mapping? And are you still happy using that term map, or are you trying to move beyond that idea of traditionally what a map is?
We resort back to map because most people understand that. And superficially it looks like a map. But you're absolutely right. Google Maps goes way beyond what we perceived a map to be in the past.
Ed Parsons, geospatial technologist for Google.
It's something that you actually interact with, that you use as an interface to other pieces of information you find online. Probably less conception of scale as there was traditionally in a map. Your map is dynamic. You can zoom in and you can zoom out and you can choose to display different pieces of information. If you look at Google Maps when you're zoomed in very closely, we use a Mercator projection.
Move the zoom slider to swoop down to street level to get a closer view.
But as you zoom out, we turn it into a globe, and a globe is a better way of representing continent-scale geography.
Now, let's go to the Swiss Alps to enjoy a beautiful sunrise.
And it's a seamless transition between those two, something you couldn't do on a paper map.
Can you just give me a sense of the scale of that data?
There are petabytes, and it just keeps continually growing because the world keeps changing.
Simon Greenman launched one of the first ever online mapping services, MapQuest, and has worked with digital maps and AI.
Very much mapping has become central to a lot of their advertising products at the moment. But what's really kind of amazing is the scale with which they've actually been able to offer mapping. At this point, I think it's 220 countries around the world that they offer online digital mapping, and then something like 170 countries that have updates for traffic things. So they've created a massive digital map of the world and serving up billions of maps on a monthly basis at this time.
Maps contain the biases of their map makers.
Laura Bliss writes and edits MapLab for Bloomberg's CityLab.
Although it just feels like the kind of all-knowing, arbiter of world geographic knowledge, Google Maps is just providing so many services at once, and obviously a huge economic benefit to the businesses and organizations and entities that are advertised on it. That might also create some limitations or blind spots.
One of the earliest inspirations for online map apps was Powers of 10, made in 1977 by Charles and Ray Eames.
We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view.
It begins with a couple picnicking in a park from 1 meter away, then zooms out by a factor of 10,
and our field of view will be 10 times wider,
to the very edge of the universe.
10 to the 6th, a 1 with 6 zeros. Soon the Earth will show as a solid sphere.
It captured the ecological whole Earth ethos of Silicon Valley's early idealism.
We are able to see the whole Earth now, just over a minute along the journey.
The challenge was to take the principle explored in Powers of 10 and unify satellite imagery with computer graphics, later street photography, to zoom seamlessly from outer space to terra firma and back again.
Google has a sense of a mission that is global.
Now we mark a small part of the path in which the Earth moves about the sun.
Influence of, the whole Earth catalogue, that sense that actually Google Earth was in some respects a browser for the planet. That ability to go from the whole planet and zoom right down to your local neighborhood without it being obvious that you were switching out different types of images and pulling in different pieces of information.
And that image that you get on Google Earth, where you see the preciousness, the blue marble floating in this blackness of space, I mean, this goes right back through the history of map making. It goes back through the Renaissance tradition, Mercator's images, all those great atlases. It goes right back to the Greeks, really, to Ptolemy, talking about the beauty of the sphere.
When we look at Google Earth and we look at its representation of that blue marble, we don't put borders on there. We display it as the planet as you would see from outer space. The blue marble that the Apollo 8 astronauts saw in 1968.
Apollo 8, this is Houston with a...
That's profound. It's such an emotive image.
7, 0, 3.
It's an interesting feature of Google Earth that you can see the globe with all national and political boundaries disabled. An idealistic vision of a borderless world? Or an expression of the corporation's own political power, transcending nation-states. Maps have always been intimately connected to military technology. As its name implies, the Ordnance Survey took its name from the English military mapping of Scotland following the Jacobite Rising of 1745. Similarly, the US military took an early interest in online mapping.
Visual target. That's 342 target.
Google Earth, the company's earliest map app, developed out of Keyhole, mapping software used to simulate US bombing raids in Iraq.
Stroke 3, defending SA2. Stroke 3, you're on your
The CIA invested in the company, announcing that it could see the value of Keyhole's technology to the military security community. Google bought Keyhole in October 2004, pouring in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of commercial satellite and aerial data. Let's talk about the history of the rise of online mapping applications, and particularly Google's. Where did that technology come from?
Yeah, so the in-joke of Keyhole, the company that created Google Earth, was that it was partially funded by In-Q-Tel, who was a CIA investment house. But the name of the company, Keyhole, was also the name of the secret program of Earth observation satellites that the National Reconnaissance Office in the United States ran. So it was always a bit of an insider's joke. And at least initially, obviously some of the big users of Google Earth were people within the defense and intelligence community.
The mapping operations were some of the first obvious and global scale operations to achieve economies of scope, behavioral data from the real world, and that began with mapping.
In her work around what she calls surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff is highly critical of Google's information empire and the importance of maps to its data gathering.
Google Earth began as a company called Keyhole, largely owned by the CIA. It had been invented by a man named John Henke.
A lot of debate. Ultimately, we decided to sell to Google. In hindsight, it was absolutely the right thing to do. But
Henke went with it to Google, where he ran Google Earth and the larger mapping operation. And ultimately, he became the key person who led the Street View operation.
We needed the server infrastructure. We needed the additional engineering.
Which now took the mapping from the satellite right down to the ground level.
Data. We could get this area and this area, and we could probably do the top cities, maybe the top 200 cities around the world.
Through our neighborhoods and our city streets, so that once they could track our location, understand where we were coming from, where we were going, the interior of buildings, how those are mapped, all of this, of course, becoming rich sources of behavioral data that are highly, highly predictive.
Central to the new mapping technology was the use of search. Google receives nearly 4 million online searches a minute. and when an estimated 30 to 40% of them have some geographical content, our searchers, along with their likes and preferences, begin to create a vast online map, or web, that we are now part of.
The big tech companies clearly have what can be described as almost a surveillance infrastructure for the world. They know everything about where you are. So they are building a map of really the human population and where we're moving in real time.
There's a sense in which Google is so far ahead around its mapping applications that there doesn't really seem to be any competition.
Very much so. It is a monopoly, maybe a duopoly at best, but Apple has still got a long way to catch up with Google. I mean, some of the most interesting work going on, I think, at the moment is really around the use of mapping, digital mapping and artificial intelligence. So, for example, I think it was last year, Project Maven was a project between the US government and Google to really use AI and mapping and facial recognition technologies to be able to identify potential targets and have smart drones take them out, unfortunately, in real time. And that involves AI, it involves knowing maps of terrains. Now, at the same time, what was interesting, that the ethics and morals of this caused a walkout by Google employees. They said, this is not something we want our technologies to be involved with. And Google subsequently actually said they would stop working on that project.
This all seems a long way from historical physical maps, drawn on stone, papyrus and paper, combining art with science, representing imperial and national territory, but also shaping religious worldviews. Imagining utopia, nirvana, monsters and mythology, heaven and hell. They created their own fields of knowledge and skills, cosmography, surveying, cartography, and were always at the forefront of new inventions like printing. Even the orientation of a map has its own story to tell. North was only placed at the top of the world map in the last 400 years. Before then it was east, with Jerusalem at the centre. For Islam, south was at the top, but never west on any map. That's where the sun sets and darkness awaits.
Well, you see one of the greatest maps of London ever produced, with what we would call street view.
I met the former head of maps at the British Library, Peter Barber, at Lauderdale House in London. There on the wall is William Morgan's vast map of the city, an incredibly detailed street view as it was in 1676. And if you look really closely at the tiny deer drawn in St James's Park, you can see their shadows are cast as though the sun was shining in the north, which is of course impossible. A cartographer's trick to remind us that however detailed, a map is never reality.
Everybody believes when they look at a map, particularly a modern map, that they're looking at the truth. You know, a second of reflection reveals that it cannot possibly be so, because it has to be a selection from the truth, tailored to the requirements of the user and reflecting the values of the society in which it's produced.
And that's regardless of form, I assume you would say as well. So you can see that process through manuscript maps, through printed paper maps, and you can now indeed see it in terms of the move online with mapping.
If I can put it into the modern lingo, when you look at a Google map, paid for by a whole group of private businesses, when you look at the map, you see the private businesses, and the private businesses almost block out what we would consider to be important things. And here you do actually get a clash between the commercial view of a place and, if you like, the inhabitants' view of the place, largely because of the value systems behind the mapping.
The genius of Google and what they really demonstrate is that online advertising could work. And with all their data about you, where you were looking, that sort of thing, they could really start personalizing and targeting the ads to you. So they became very good at monetizing their search and monetizing maps. And in fact, today, rumor has it that the mapping is worth about $3.6 billion a year for advertising around the mapping.
Using applications on handheld electronic devices means that rather than locating ourselves on a map as we once did, digital maps put the user at the centre. The map now follows us. And as it surveys our digital footprint of searches, likes and preferences, it creates a map of who we are too. How do you think that the shift to online mapping has changed people's apprehension of maps? I mean, what's it done to cognition?
They are based around you. The blue dot in the centre of the map, your location, means that the map is your map. It's centred on you. And that relates to this concept of Tobler's first law of geography. Those things that are close to you are going to be more interesting than those that are further away. Now, and it sounds really obvious, but it's actually fundamental to why technology companies like Google are interested in maps.
The more we're using apps like Google Maps or even Uber or Airbnb or any app that allows us to do a digital transaction, the way that our own location data is in turn feeding back into maps and feeding back into the map-based services that we're buying. The more reliant we are on digital maps, the more we are, in fact, part of the map itself, a part of the future map.
Online mapping emerged from military technology to offer an apparently democratic vision of how users can map their surroundings. These global corporations now have greater resources than established national mapping agencies like Great Britain's Ordnance Survey, established over the last 200 years to cement the political authority and boundaries of the nation state. Ordnance Survey's Chief Geospatial Officer, David Henderson.
So today, Ordnance Survey is owned by the UK government as an organisation. We have to concentrate on what we know is valuable in the use of our data and to maintain that master map of Great Britain to support some of the decisions that as a nation we're really having to make now.
A respiratory pathogen that's capable of community transmission.
The risk level has risen.
Nous avons aujourd'hui les premiers cas. Crucially, the vast majority of new cases are outside China.
The COVID crisis has placed spatial technology firmly in the public and political eye, not only by showcasing location-sensitive apps of tracking and tracing, but also mapping the virus itself across the globe.
So recognising that epidemiological modelling, the mapping of epidemiology has been a really core part of both national and international responses to COVID-19. Ordnance Survey run a programme called Mapping for Emergencies, helping to identify specific locations, care homes, closely located pharmacies, supermarkets, good transport connections, open space to facilitate things like testing sites, for example.
There's been a tremendous amount of literal mapping. This is a massive public health crisis. I mean, it's a pandemic, and of course, geography has mattered enormously. Different kinds of mapping have gone on. One example that comes to mind is geospatializing the mutations in the COVID-19 genome as its nucleotides are passed from human to human. You can see the changes in the genome actually being mapped by country and mapped over time.
I guess we look at the crisis around COVID and we see that as a geographical health problem. How does Google see it, and what might Google bring to the table in terms of helping?
I think, like all the technology companies, we try to play our part, and where we can help, the public health agencies around the world. We teamed up with Apple to build the interface that's used for exposure notification.
Well, Apple and Google are teaming up to work on technology to help reduce the spread of coronavirus.
You'll have an app that you install on your phone, either Android or iPhone.
So we've agreed to join forces with Google and Apple to bring the best bits of both.
Back in April this year, there was really an unprecedented announcement between Apple and Google that they would cooperate to share your location to allow for contact tracing. So this was really unprecedented. But they got into something of a scrap with the French government because the French government said, no, we need to know where our citizens have been and who they've been in contact with so we can do full contact tracing. And Google and Apple said, no, we want to protect the privacy of the individuals and we're not going to give you that data and share it. And so it sort of relates to a question of sovereignty. Who owns your location data? Is it you as an individual? Is it these technology companies? Or is it the government here? And it's a very big question that I think we're going to see play out over the coming years, is who owns the data?
Online mapping might give the illusion of democratic access and participation, but it's driven primarily by business advertising, positioning us as consumers rather than citizens. As a result, large areas of the globe remain unmapped, and 41% of the world's population still lack internet access, a digital divide that leaves them very much off the map. But there are alternatives.
My journey began as a mapper. I was lucky when I was
in collective acts of cartography.
The process of mapping with the Missing Maps project is that we have...
driven by neither state nor corporation, but by people like you and me.
The goal of Missing Maps is to map out vulnerable areas before a disaster occurs, to reduce risk.
I'm a map maker from the Philippines.
Organizations like OpenStreetMap.
I am a map maker based in Cusco, which is a city located...
global projects like Missing Maps, pooling local knowledge from South America to Africa and the Philippines.
I've been trying to reach out to other map makers in the Pacific.
I'm based in Kampala in Uganda. So the work I do is to work with...
Cusco has many places that don't appear on the maps.
The rapidly growing counter-mapping movement, using open source maps and digital technology to interrogate and challenge dominant ways of seeing the world, whether state or corporate, or against the new forms of cyber imperialism.
Countermapping is saying, what kinds of maps do you get when you work from the bottom up rather than the top down? What happens when the people who have been on the receiving end of these kinds of mappings for most of the last 500 years get their hands on the tools to allow them to make maps for themselves?
Craig Dalton is co-founder of the Counter Cartographies Collective.
You see mapping happening with Black Lives Matter, mapping police violence.
Change in the UK is police mentality. We need to educate this. We need to be educated that this is not okay.
We also saw mapping used by the Occupy movement as a way of showing just how widespread the Occupy movement was. It was not just Occupy Wall Street. It was occupying parts of San Francisco and Chicago.
Stand against the wall. Turn around and stand against the wall.
Various cities in Asia, London. Tactical protest apps have been in the 21st century with the advent of cell phones and especially smartphones.
Apps like HK Map Live can map street events in real time, sharing geospatial data on police location and use of tear gas, adding to a continually updated tactical map, as used in recent protests in Hong Kong. China made Apple take it down. In 1612, Michael Drayton published his Polyolbion, a vast topographical poem praising England and Wales county by county, illustrated with regional maps. On each map, the landscape's features are anthropomorphized. Hills become shepherds, forests are nymphs. In an age of Jacobean royal absolutism, Drayton subtly suggested that political power lay in the nation's land, here a cornucopia, and its regional identities, not any king. Such cartographic artistry is being used today by artists pushing back against digital domination by returning to the hand-drawn map.
I use digital maps all the time, but I think even though the map moves around you, it does offer an illusion of individuality. The ownership of mediating yourself around a geographical place is who holds the power is just given up to the formulation of the app.
The artist Stephen Walter explores the breakdown of place and cultural memory in his minutely hand-drawn maps.
Wow.
Painstaking forays above and below the ground.
Okay, so this is a London subterranean map, which is basically a mapping of many of the infrastructures that exist underground in London. All the burial sites, the cemeteries, the catacombs, archaeological finds, the estimated shoreline from 420,000 years ago, the sewer network, the disused rail lines, the post office railway, the old pneumatic railway. It really dives into everything that exists underground, the water ring main, underground radio stations.
There's a transgression, there's a sort of stepping over that boundary, and you are certainly pushing the limits of what gets mapped in that way. How are you moving around? Because it seems to me, dare I say it, that this is a sort of image of guerrilla cartography almost. There's a reality to what you're showing here which wouldn't be seen on any paper map or indeed on an online map.
In making the map, I went underground myself into sewers and other infrastructure. And really the subterranean map hopes to be in some way a kind of fuel base or a kind of talisman for all those people that wish to explore more.
In his short story On Exactitude in Science, written in 1946, the Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges tells of a fictional empire that created a map whose size was that of the empire and coincided point for point with it. A map on a scale of 1 to 1 is the only truly accurate map, but its size makes it useless. To assume that digital mapping now delivers us absolute accuracy is a dangerous fallacy and misses Borges' point. All maps pursue certain agendas, define the world in one way rather than another. And now we could be sleepwalking into a situation where multinational corporations map a future world and map us according to their commercial imperatives. So don't believe exclusively in the online map. Don't give up completely on the paper map. There are still alternatives, and you can follow different routes. Happy mapping.